So one of the greatest astrobiologists ever once said, if you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe. Does anybody know who that was? Carl Sagan, yeah. Today we know that the universe began with a bang that filled our cosmos with hydrogen. And hydrogen is like my favorite element because it's got this really awesome property. You see, hydrogen is a colorless, odorless gas that, given enough time, turns into people. Isn't that amazing? I love this perspective. So I'm an astrobiologist at the University of Washington. And astrobiology is the study of the origins, the distribution, and the fate of life in the universe. In other words, astrobiology is the study of how you go from a universe full of the simplest of elements, hydrogen, and create complex structures that we would call life. Things that can evolve to the point at which they can look around and begin to ask the questions, where did we come from? And are we alone? In other words, astrobiology is the story of who we are, why we're here, and where we are going. It's a deeply personal and deeply scientific story. But let's get back to making that apple pie. Right? Hydrogen is not going to do anything by itself. We need to turn it into the richness of the periodic table. Here is that periodic table, color-coded by the formation mechanism of each of the elements. So you'll see that hydrogen, most of helium, a little bit of lithium are coded green to denote that they were formed in the Big Bang itself. Virtually every other element on this chart was formed in the death throes of stars, including this deep purple that you see down here. That denotes merging neutron stars, which is a discovery that we only confirmed just a few years ago, thanks to the advent of gravitational wave astronomy. All right. Let me highlight for you the elements that are involved in life. So, as most of you will recall from your biology classes, we are carbon-based life forms. And we're mainly comprised of these 6 elements in green here, so carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, and hydrogen. So people often say that we are schnapps. Schnapps. But we are more than just schnapps. All right? And to show you that, I am going to highlight in red here the major ions of life. These are involved in all sorts of amazing processes like neurotransmission and the creation of bones and shells and other hard parts. And in magenta, I have highlighted for you the major transition metals of life. These are involved in a whole host of electron transfer processes in our metabolisms, without which we would most certainly stop breathing and collapse. And in yellow, I have highlighted all of the other elements that are known to cycle through the biosphere here on Earth. All right, so you can see that life actually uses most of the periodic table. So what does this mean? This means that you are no less than 73% exploding massive stars, 16.5% dying low-mass stars, 9.5% primordial Big Bang nucleosynthesis, 1% white dwarf, and a smidgen of a percent, what's there? Merging neutron star. Right? So this brings me to my first of my 5 major takeaways from this talk. The first ingredient in our cosmic apple pie of astrobiological understanding that we'll bake together tonight. And you've probably heard it before, but it's just such a profound statement. We are star stuff, that it has to be among my top 5 takeaways. But not only are we star stuff, but we're also more than schnapps. Right? And some of those other elements are going to come in a big role later on in tonight's adventure. All right, so I got my PhD just last year. Wasn't that long ago. Graduated from Caltech with a degree in planetary science. And as those of you who have done grad school know, it can be a really trying time. And I've seen a lot of people come in very bright and happy and optimistic, and then start to get drained by the work and the research and all the classes you need to take. Start getting a little bit more jaded, a little bit pessimistic. And it was during one of those lowest of times that one of my friends turned to me and said something rather startling. He said, "Mike, you think you're something special? You think you're star stuff? Well, you may be star stuff, but so is a pile of trash." Jeez, what a downer. I mean, like, nothing that he said was wrong. Yes, trash is star stuff too. But I would like to take a different perspective. I would like to use the star stuffiness of trash not to put ourselves down, but maybe to say we should look a little bit more fondly at our trash. Reuse, recycle, repurpose our garbage into beautiful things like a portrait made of leftover beads and buttons, or this tidal wave made up of whatever these very large Blu-ray discs are. The French have a term for this, objet trouvé, or found art. And I know it seems a little bit far-fetched right now, but the idea of found art is going to also come back and play a very important role in our astrobiological journey today. So keep that in the back of your mind as well. All right, but let's get down to business, trying to find life elsewhere besides Earth. Trying to answer that question, are we alone? And to me, there is no more exciting a place to try to answer that question than Jupiter's moon, Europa, which we know has a global subsurface ocean of liquid water. And I'm not the only person excited about Europa. In fact, NASA is planning one of its next flagship missions to go and explore this moon of Jupiter. Its name is the Europa Clipper, and it will orbit Jupiter and make multiple flybys of Europa. It's a reconnaissance mission. Its job is to basically get a better handle on Europa's habitability and to find the optimal spot for a future Europa lander, which you can see here in this artist's depiction, with one of its sample arms stretched out, ready to grab some of that surface material and analyze it, probably in a mass spectrometer, for signs of life. And you also see in this image this very charismatic plume coming out of the surface of Europa. And indeed, ever since the year 2014, scientists have gained a tenuous understanding of potential cryovolcanism on Europa. Right? And so what you're looking at here is one of those data sets captured by the Hubble Space Telescope in the ultraviolet. You're looking at the emission of atomic hydrogen on the top here and atomic oxygen on the bottom panels here. You can watch this plume sort of come and go off the limb of the solid body of Europa. The emissions of atomic hydrogen and oxygen can be indicative of the dissociation of a local enhancement of water vapor in Europa's atmosphere, and that's consistent with plume activity that is sampling the subsurface ocean of liquid water. And so if any of that plume material comes back down to Europa, and if there's anything potentially living underneath that ice shell, gets dragged up and falls down here, maybe a Europa lander could find that evidence for life. But what we all dream about for Europa is something like this. Europa submersible. Something that can actually plumb the depths of this icy moon and search its subsurface ocean for signs of extant life. And indeed, some of my colleagues at JPL, scientists and engineers, are building prototypes of an autonomous submersible and testing it in Arctic waters. Now, some of these people are my friends, and I know that they do a fantastic job, but I have to say that realistically, something that is like what is depicted in this artist's impression probably won't come around for another couple of decades, simply because we have to do all the other preparatory missions first before we can send something like this. So even though we can't yet taste the salty liquid in Europa's ocean, it's it's still nonetheless an amazing, wondrous place to think about here from Earth. I mean, Europa has more liquid water inside of it than all of Earth's oceans combined. That is an astounding fact to me, right? How can tiny Europa, and this image is the scale, so far away from the sun, maintain such a vast volume of liquid water? To answer that question, we need to look at the situation that Europa is in. So Europa orbits Jupiter as part of a quartet of large moons, called the Galilean satellites after Galileo, who discovered them in 1610. Their names are Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. And it turns out that as these moons do their little orbital dance around Jupiter, they are constantly squished and squashed by Jupiter's intense gravitational field. And the squishing and squashing deposits heat in their interiors in a process that we call tidal heating. And so Io, being the closest of the moons to Jupiter, receives a lot of tidal heating. Too much, in fact, to make it habitable by any conventional metrics. But it does make it the most volcanically active object in our solar system, this tiny moon of Jupiter. Ganymede and Callisto, on the other hand, get too little tidal heating. And that's because they're farther away, and also in the case of Callisto, because it doesn't actually participate in this dance, this orbital dance, quite the right way. But Europa, on the other hand, gets just enough tidal heating to maintain that nice ocean of liquid water underneath the surface. And so this is sort of like a tidal heating Goldilocks zone, if you will. Now, when astrobiologists say that Europa is a prime astrobiological target to look for life, implicit in that statement is the fact that we think that it's a good place for life to live, right? And so what, besides the fact that Europa has liquid water, makes it a good place for life to live? Well, to answer that question, we need to think just a little bit deeper about what it means to be alive, what life does, and what life needs. Now, I've never met a Europan life form. I have met myself, and I know what I do. I eat and I breathe. And I'm very fond of ice cream, and I have to say that I'm a big fan of oxygen, too. And so this is how my metabolism works. I take the electrons from the electron-rich food that I eat, and I transfer them to the electron-greedy oxygen in the air that I breathe. Right? And that powers me to stand up here and talk about cool things with you, like astrobiology. Now, if the transfer of electrons to release energy is a little bit weird to you, I promise you it's not a strange phenomenon at all. It's exactly what happens when you light a piece of wood on fire, same type of process, and when you flip a switch to power any number of fantastic electrical devices. Right? So in general, what it can be said is that life alleviates a chemical disequilibrium in the environment between some environmental reductant or electron donor, or some environmental oxidant or electron acceptor. It's the transfer of electrons between the two that powers life. Okay? And so this brings me to the second of my main takeaways or ingredients in our cosmic apple pie. And it's this, that life is electric. There is nothing metaphorical about this. Electron transfer powers life. You can say that life completes a geochemical circuit between some reductant and some oxidant. And so when we talk about the habitability of Europa, besides the fact that it has liquid water, we need to ask ourselves next, is there something to eat on Europa, and is there something to breathe? You need both ends of the battery. Just one won't do. Well, luckily for us, we think that the answer to both of those questions is yes. So this is how you would make a living on Europa. All right. So it turns out that we suspect that deep beneath Europa's ice shell, at the bottom of its subsurface ocean, are hydrothermal vents. And by studying the hydrothermal vents here on Earth, we know that they are rich in chemical reductants, in food for life. In fact, there is so much raw chemical energy coming out of the hydrothermal vents on our planet that some of the most biologically productive ecosystems on our world are situated at the bottom of the ocean, completely devoid of the energy of sunlight. So there's plenty of food on Europa. What about something to breathe? Well, Europa doesn't have much in the way of an atmosphere, but it does have this ice shell. And And this ice shell is constantly being bombarded by high energy radiation. Radiation directly from the sun, radiation that's been trapped in Jupiter's magnetosphere. Some of these radiation particles even originate at Europa's sister moon Io. Remember, this is a volcanic object. It's constantly spewing things out into space. When these energetic particles slam into Europa's surface, they sputter away the hydrogen from this water ice. What are left over are oxidants. And if the forces of tidal heating that maintain this global subsurface ocean of liquid water are also able to crack this surface ice shell, or melt it, or cause it to convect, then some of these oxidants from the surface can make their way down into the depths of the ocean, where they could be breathed, essentially, by hypothetical European life forms. So these are the planetary processes that make Europa a habitable environment. I want to take a quick aside and introduce you to some fantastic critters from the bottom of our ocean. And I put aliens in quotations here because obviously these are not aliens, they're from Earth, and they fall well within the tree of life that we know and love here on our planet. But they're nonetheless studied intensely by astrobiologists because they give us insights into the kinds of adaptations or lifestyles that we might expect on a world like Europa. So the first of these critters that I want to introduce you to is the scaly-foot snail. The scaly-foot snail has some of the most resilient armor of any natural entity that we have ever encountered. And it gains this resiliency from its triple-layered structure of this armor. The top structure is an iron sulfide plate. It was actually precipitated by symbiotic bacteria on this gastropod's surface. The middle layer is an organic, gooey substance. It is really good at absorbing the blow of any impact. And the final layer is this mineral called aragonite. It gives this entire shell its rigidity and its shape. And so this was so remarkable that when scientists discovered this snail, and word got out about it, the US Army decided that they were so impressed that they would pour tons of money into scientific research to, I don't know, maybe they just wanted to build Iron Man or something from the snail's armor. But they really were so impressed. Now the next critter that I want to introduce you to is the octopus. You may love octopi, but astrobiologists love octopi in particular because they represent a form of alternative intelligence. You see, only 10% of an octopus's neurons are located in what we would identify as its centralized brain. 30% can be found behind its optic lobes, but 60% are in its arms. This means that an octopus's arms can essentially think for themselves. Think about what that would mean for you if your arms could think for themselves and do things that your brain didn't want them to do. It's a completely different neurological architecture. But not only is it a different architecture, it's also a different evolutionary trajectory that arose, that was responsible for the octopus's intelligence. And octopi are very intelligent. They're known to use tools to escape predators. And so we think that intelligence arose in our lineage, in primates and in humans, due to socio-ecological factors. In essence, because we needed to make teams and alliances with one another. That's actually humankind's greatest evolutionary advantage over other things. It's our trait to be able to make flexible alliances and teams. But octopi are very solitary creatures. And so scientists think that their intelligence arose because of some kind of predator-prey dynamic at the bottom of the ocean. And so this means that there were two evolutionary trajectories, at least, on our very own planet that were responsible for the rise of intelligence. And this just opens the door to other types of intelligence that we might find out there. I think we need to reel ourselves back a little bit because we're on the verge of having a multi-hour-long discussion about hypothetical intelligent octopi, squid, whales, mermaids on Europa. I think we need to take a few steps back and ask ourselves a different question. I was going to say a simpler question, but it really isn't simpler. How would you even start the simplest life on Europa? How would you begin biogenesis? in a world so different from ours. So this brings me to the topic of the origin of life, which is one of the greatest scientific mysteries that is yet to be solved. Now, in general, origin of life theories go something like this. On the surface of a young, hot, rocky world, you have these organic chemicals mingling together in what many people would call a primordial soup. This soup would be energized by ultraviolet sunlight, and the sunlight would help these molecules complexify, and they would concentrate in drying pools, and eventually, somehow, somewhere, somewhen, the right chemicals came together to create the first self-replicating molecule. And people think that was RNA. And all around this would be tidal waves and volcanic eruptions and asteroid impacts and lightning strikes. It was a really devastating place to be. And you might rightfully ask the question, as many scientists have for many generations, how do you create something as complex as a living cell amidst such chaos, such destruction, such entropy? This puzzled, among many others, one of the great astrophysicists, Fred Hoyle, who wrote in 1984 comparing the origin of life to the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard would assemble a Boeing 747 with the materials therein. And more related to our discussion, how would you create an origin of life on Europa? A world that doesn't have surface liquid, it doesn't have an atmosphere rich in organic chemistry, it doesn't have the availability of ultraviolet light to energize those prebiotic molecules. How could you do that? Well, I'll give you my suggestion tonight, but first, a word of caution. The origin of life is far from a settled debate. And in fact, the word debate might be a bit of a kind word to describe the origin of life community. You see, we only have one instance of life to study so far. And we know still very little about the exact environmental nature of the Earth many billions of years ago when life first took a foothold on our planet. We don't know what the exact forces were at play at the origin of life. All right, so this means that astrobiologists who study the origin of life are very prone to wielding their emotions in addition to their data, or perhaps in place of their data. And I was caught in the middle of one of these arguments just a few years ago when I published a paper about Earth's early atmosphere with implications for a specific origin of life theory. For those of you who don't know, when you want to publish a scientific paper, you submit it to a journal, and then the journal sends that paper out for peer review. What that means is that anonymous, quote-unquote, experts in the field get to review your unpublished manuscript, check your results, check your logic, check your data, and hopefully, in an ideal world, this would be an honest intellectual debate that would strengthen the science that's being reported. The anonymity of this process means that people can easily take advantage of the system. Anybody who's ever been on the internet knows this. So when we submitted this paper, unfortunately, one of our reviewers was very in love with their own origin of life theory, which happened to be different from the origin of life theory that we were discussing in our paper. And so when we got the review back, it looked basically like a lecture, telling us why all of our ideas were bogus and why theirs were right. And so we responded to this review, hopefully in a cordial way. We said, just because you have different views to us about life's emergence doesn't amount to pertinent criticism. Well, the reviewer thought differently. They replied, I'm interested in cerebral, not intestinal arguments. My theory is based on experimentally justified physical chemistry, while yours is subjective gastric testimony. Ouch! Well, one of my advisors was not very happy with this. And he wrote back, from our point of view, all biogenesis models like yours are inherently and manifestly untenable Frankenstein myths. That would show them, right? If only he stopped there. But he went on. He said, and we would like to also observe that your quite essential and elementary misunderstandings and lapses of scholarship should rightly be accounted as failures of cerebral, not gastrointestinal function. Now, luckily, I was the first author on this paper, which meant I got to edit this before we sent it back to the reviewer. Otherwise, I'm sure we'd still be arguing about this paper to this day. But this gives you a glimpse into the origin of life community, right? It's very contentious. And before I go forward discussing the origin of life in particular, I want to just remind you that all origin of life theories right now are just hypotheses, waiting to be tested, okay? But I'll give you my suggestion for an origin of life theory that makes sense to me and that seems to work for a world like Europa, okay? And it goes all the way back to our understanding of what life does. This part is not in question. We know that life operates by alleviating a chemical disequilibrium in its environment. And luckily, we already talked about this today. And so if you view life as a low entropy, highly complex structure whose job it is to alleviate a disequilibrium in the environment, you can start to see life in the context of other astrophysical phenomena. And I'll give you a couple examples. These are phenomena that see a disequilibrium in the universe, a disequilibrium that has a barrier to its immediate resolution, and which constitute the low entropy, highly complex structure that is the resolution to that disequilibrium. I'll give you a few examples. The first is a star. So there is a fundamental disequilibrium in the universe between the hydrogen and the helium that's left over in the Big Bang, okay? And the heavier nuclei, all the way up to iron. So you have some hydrogen floating around the interstellar medium. If two hydrogens meet each other, right, they would love to fuse and become something heavier. That would constitute a lower energy state for them. But they can't because of this intrinsic Coulomb repulsion and also the slow rate of weak interaction events, the events that turn a proton into a neutron during nucleosynthesis. Only in the high density, high temperature regimes in the cores of stars can you begin to beat this barrier and alleviate this disequilibrium. And stars constitute very low entropy structures within themselves. They're highly ordered, balls of gaseous hydrogen and helium, and they serve to increase the entropy of everything else external to them by shining that light away. So planets also have natural disequilibria. One of them that you would be very familiar with is a temperature gradient. So as you all know from your elementary physics classes, if you have a high temperature reservoir next to a low temperature reservoir and you connect the two, heat will diffuse or conduct between the two until their temperatures are equivalent. But if the medium connecting those reservoirs has low enough thermal conductivity, then you might create convection cells. And convection cells are in and of themselves low entropy structures that serve to dissipate this temperature gradient and increase the entropy of everything else in the universe. And you see this in your bowls of soup, you see this in Earth's atmosphere, you throw a little Coriolis force in and you get these highly intricate structures that we already saw tonight, which are hurricanes. Planets also have chemical or redox disequilibrium. Right? And the barriers to immediately resolving these chemical disequilibria are the activation energies of these chemical reactions. And so it can be said that what life does is to overcome the activation energies of chemical reactions and relieve planets of their innate redox gradients faster than chemistry, pure chemistry would alone. And this is how life would maintain its low entropy, highly ordered structure. So let me show you how the electron transfer that powers life and that relieves the redox gradient is actually used in your cells. So we're going to dive deep into our mitochondria, which I'm told I need to say is the powerhouse of the cell. So your mitochondria look like this. You have this outer membrane, an inner membrane, and this intermembrane space. Okay? And the way you use electron transfer is by allowing the electrons to hop from one protein complex to another in your inner membrane. This is called the electron transport chain in biology. Every time an electron hops, it loses a little bit of energy. That energy is used to pump a proton into the intermembrane space. So the electron is going to hop, the proton is going to pump, and the electron is going to hop, the proton is going to be pumped until the electron falls to its terminal electron acceptor, an oxidant, in our case, molecular oxygen, that's what we breathe. And as a result, you have transformed a redox gradient into a gradient of protons. So, you can imagine now that you are one of these protons, stuck in this tiny intermembrane space surrounded by all these other protons. You're repulsing each other, you just want to get away. And you're able to do that by flowing through what is called ATP synthase. This is a rotor protein, and it uses the energy of those flowing protons to create ATP, which is the energy currency of life. Okay? So this is how you create ATP. You transduce a disequilibrium in electrons into a disequilibrium of protons, and finally into ATP. And you are doing this many billions of times per second. Every single second that you are alive, you transfer 10 to the power 21 electrons in your body. That is to say, in the span of 2 minutes, you have transferred as many electrons in your body as there are stars in the observable universe. 2 minutes. Talk about beating that activation energy. Talk about accelerating chemistry. That's what biology is. But it does this in a very weird kind of way. And I'm going to play the slide again for you because it took me an hour to make it. So, right, you are transferring electrons, and why? Because you want to pump protons. That's weird. You pump protons just so that they can build up on one side of this membrane and fall back to where they came from. What a weird system. What a Rube Goldberg-like apparatus. Many of you are engineers, I've gathered, and if you were asked to engineer life, you wouldn't do it this way. This is kind of crazy and complicated. Why would you do this? Why does life on Earth universally create its ATP through this mechanism, which is called in the biological community using the proton motive force or chemiosmotic coupling? Why does all life on Earth work this way? And it may be telling us something about our heritage, about our history, about the origin of life. Right? Maybe at the beginning of life, life took advantage of two natural disequilibrium. A redox disequilibrium, or a chemical disequilibrium for sure, that it alleviated with electron transfers, but also a proton disequilibrium, naturally available in the environment. In other words, a pH gradient, because pH is the measure of the concentration of protons in the fluid. So if we start thinking like that, when we look around for natural geochemical settings with both of these qualities, that takes us back to hydrothermal vents. In particular, a flavor of hydrothermal vents called alkaline hydrothermal vents. These vents are fueled by a process known as serpentinization. That's just a water-rock interaction that creates hydrogen. Hydrogen is a really good reductant or electron donor. So the fluids that are coming out of these vents are rich in hydrogen gas. Serpentinization is also an exothermic reaction, which means it warms these fluids to between 40 and 90 degrees Celsius, which is pretty warm, but also not devastatingly hot for biosynthesis. The fluids that come out of these vents are also very alkaline in nature. They have a pH of somewhere between 9 and 11. And by visiting these vents today, microbiologists have discovered that they host a diverse set of microbial communities, some of which are performing very ancient forms of metabolism. And if you were able to dive down to one of these vents and take one of these chimneys and bring it all the way back to the surface, go into a lab, slice it open, and take a microscope to it, this is what you would see. A porous maze of microscopic compartments, each about the size of a living cell, and the walls of these compartments comprised of the minerals aragonite and brucite. Then you start thinking outside of the box and you realize, wait a minute, roughly 4 billion years ago, when life first took a foothold on this planet, the ocean chemistry was very different. It was full of dissolved iron, which means that these types of vents 4 billion years ago would have mineral walls that are rich in catalytic iron-sulfur minerals, named mckinnowite, greigite, and green rust. And if you don't know what those minerals are, don't worry, I'll show you on the next slide. But what those minerals mean is that these little vesicles in here would be ideal for not just concentrating organic monomers, but also polymerizing them, complexifying them into larger and larger chemicals. All right. So on this graph, I am showing you 3 of the minerals that would have been present at those ancient hydrothermal vents: mckinnowite, greigite, and violorite. You can see the mineral structures in this graph, and you can also see their chemical compositions by comparing these colors to the legend up here. What you see are lots of sulfur and iron and nickel. Now these top things up here, those are the active sites of enzymes in modern day biology. Never mind their crazy names. What they do is the heart of modern biological metabolisms. They take hydrogen gas, CO2 gas, and turn those two into organic molecules that are then fed into the main biosynthesis pathways. And what you should observe from this chart, from each of these pairs, is the extraordinary similarity in both geometry and composition between these minerals and the active sites of the enzymes hard at work in biology today. It's almost as if you could just tweak these minerals a little bit and create the enzymes that we see. It's also suggestive of the fact that these minerals alone could do the job of these enzymes, just not as efficiently. Right? So this brings me to the third ingredient in our apple pie of astrobiological understanding. And it's this, that it's the inorganic elements that bring organic chemistry to life. At the hearts of our proteins and enzymes are what look like minerals. And it's these iron molecules, these iron atoms, these nickel atoms, these molybdenum and tungsten that do the electron transfer, that allows our metabolisms to persist. And it's suggestive of a history, perhaps, where minerals may have been the objet trouvé, or the found art at the origin of life. These minerals actually catalyzed the creation of the first biological molecules, and then were co-opted into creating the first enzymes, because they were just all lying around in these hydrothermal settings. So if we take the entire picture together, the alkaline hydrothermal vent theory for the origin of life proceeds something like this. You have the Earth's early ocean, which is rich in dissolved CO2, which is volcanically sourced. This means that the ocean is carbonic in nature with a slightly acidic pH of 5. Some of the seawater is going to dive into the oceanic crust and participate in that serpentinization reaction. That reaction fundamentally changes the water that is coming out of the ocean crust. It is now infused with these hydrothermal fuels, hydrogen, as well as a little bit of methane. When it comes out, it is precipitating lots of metals, including iron-sulfur complexes, into this hydrothermal mound. It's warmed by the serpentinization reaction, and it has a radically different pH of about 11. And it is this redox disequilibrium, or this chemical disequilibrium, between the hydrogen coming out of these vent fluids and the CO2 in the surrounding seawater that can be the onset for biological synthesis. But not only that, in this environment, there's also a natural and strong pH or proton gradient to be taken advantage of. And I'll remind you, those of you who have taken chemistry a long time ago, that pH is on a logarithmic scale, and it's also backwards, which means that the difference between pH 5 here and pH 11 here of 6 pH units means that there is 1,000,000 times more protons per unit volume in the surrounding seawater here than in the vent fluid in here. And that is a lot of free energy that you can take advantage of. Right? So, this is all theory. In practice, does it actually work? Are there actually organics produced in these hydrothermal settings? Well, until recently, we weren't exactly sure. But just last year, a paper came out where some very adventurous expeditioners actually went to the bottom of the ocean, to the Lost City hydrothermal fields, the most famous type, the most famous alkaline hydrothermal vent in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. They drilled some 173 meters below the seafloor to some deeply serpentinized rock, brought it back up. This is what it looks like under a microscope. And when they took their spectroscopic techniques to this, they found evidence for the creation of aromatic hydrocarbons. Aromatic simply means these ring-like shapes, which are prevalent and very important to life. Right? Well, it takes a lot of energy, a lot of funding, and a lot of time to go all the way to the bottom of the ocean to collect these samples. So some scientists are trying to bring the ocean floor up to us. They are working in the lab to simulate hydrothermal environments. And this is work done by my friend and colleague at JPL, Lori Barge, and she basically builds her own hydrothermal vents in her lab, in these tubes. And you can see one growing right here. And she can watch, under these settings, with both a redox and a pH gradient, pyruvate, for instance, which is a simple organic molecule, turn into the amino acid alanine, which is one of the main building blocks of proteins and an essential amino acid for life. All right? This was work done last year and this year. This is very recent news. Okay? And so it may be that the signs are pointing to an actual way to generate complex organic molecules in hydrothermal vent settings, completely abiotic. And if this is true, then to summarize this part of the talk, what we've done so far tonight is we've gone from the Big Bang, which produced hydrogen all over the universe, turned that hydrogen in stars into the richness of the periodic table, which was the feedstock for protoplanetary disks that eventually formed planets. And planets naturally come with this onion-like structure. Right? That onion-like structure means that there are natural gradients between the two different layers. And alkaline hydrothermal vents are focusing centers for two specific planetary disequilibrium: a chemical or redox disequilibrium between the hydrothermal hydrogen and the surrounding CO2 of the seawater, and this proton gradient or pH gradient between the two fluids. And it could be that this was the onset of biochemistry, which would have proceeded very messily and kind of randomly at first, but then would have quickly been catalyzed and streamlined by those amazing minerals in those hydrothermal vents. And those minerals would eventually become a part of this biochemical network, perhaps becoming the first enzymes that would eventually lead to cycles of organic chemistry that could pass along hereditary information and eventually create things that we know today to pass on information like RNA molecules and DNA molecules, and usher us into a new age of Darwinian evolution that gave us the last universal common ancestors of our phylogenetic trees, on and on through many other vast leaps in complexity to us. Life forms that can look around and ask the questions, where did we come from? And are we alone? But all the while, still being powered by the same two fundamental disequilibria as at the beginning: electrons and protons. And this is why we must go to the ocean worlds. Because in the alkaline hydrothermal vent theory for the origin of life, it is that interface between water and rock that produces the geochemical systems, those hydrothermal vents that might be essential in the origin of life. And these ocean worlds, so many brilliant worlds that need to be uncovered, have examples of similar interfaces between water and rock. There are actually only two of them that we are certain of today that have that interface. The first is Jupiter's moon Europa, which we talked about earlier tonight. And the second one is Saturn's moon Enceladus. Saturn's moon Enceladus is this gift of a moon, because not only does it have that water-rock interface, it also has these water plumes that are just erupting constantly from its south pole. This is very different from the plumes that we think might be present at Europa, which are tenuous, and sparse, and sporadic. These plumes are perennial and very vigorous. There is so much material just constantly pouring out of Enceladus' south pole that it creates its own ring around Saturn. Right? This diffuse E ring here. Does anybody think they see Enceladus in this image? All right, I know it's getting late in the talk, so we're going to do some exercise. Point at where you think Enceladus is in this image. Boom! I think most of you got it right. So that's Enceladus, creating all of that material in that E-ring. Just for fun, you're also in this picture too. I don't know if you can find Earth, but it's right there. It's literally a tiny pixel. That's you, that's everybody you've ever known. And those crazy living creatures from that pale blue dot sent a spacecraft all the way to Saturn to take this image and to fly through the plumes of Enceladus. It's called the Cassini spacecraft, and it made multiple flybys of these plumes and tasted the material that was gushing out from the interior of that body. And what did it find? Of course, it found organics. So this is a mass spectrum, which means on the x-axis you've got the mass of the different molecules that Cassini is tasting versus their abundance. And so in this plot you can see evidence for water, for ammonia, for methane, for carbon dioxide, but you also see evidence for complex organics, leading all the way up to organics with 6 carbon atoms. And this was from early on in the mission, from 2009. Just last year, there was an update of the same authors. They used a different instrument on on Cassini, to examine the plume material from Enceladus, and they found high molecular organics. Macromolecular organics, this is the same kind of scale, except it's measuring time of flight in